Thank you for accepting our invitation, Professor Nogueira.
It's my pleasure. Glad to be here.
Well, I'd like to start with one very important question, I think. You have a huge experience working in international financial structures, and you are probably one of the very few economists who could compare from your own experience International Monetary Fund with a new structure, which is New Development Bank by BRICS. So the Western financial institution and the BRICS financial institutions. How could you compare them?
Well, I spent 8 years in the IMF in Washington, and then I moved directly to Shanghai to be one of the founding members of the New Development Bank. Why did we create the New Development Bank? Specifically because the IMF was not responding to the need for change. There was some change in the IMF in 2008, 2009, 2010, but since 2010, the structure of the IMF, and the same holds for the World Bank, by the way, became frozen. No reforms were made, and no reforms are feasible, are likely to happen in the visible future. So at one point, I think it was back in 2011, more or less 2011, 2012, the BRICS realized that we needed to, put together our own show, not leave the IMF and the World Bank, which were all there. All the BRICS are still there, of course, but create an alternative. And this was done. I moved to Shanghai in 2015, where I stayed until the end of 2017. And we tried to construct something new. I'm going to be frank with you. The New Development Bank, the so-called BRICS Bank, is actually only starting. It's even after 10 years or 11 now, it's still struggling to become a strong institution. It's not easy to build, a multilateral institution. The BRICS had never done that before as a group. So we're learning by doing. And I'm sort of disappointed with the progress we made. I'll just give you one example. It was supposed to be a global bank, but it cannot be a global bank with only 10 members, which is the situation now. The 5 original BRICS plus 5 that joined afterwards. We had to have much more new members. I don't know about Poland. Maybe Poland would like to join. It's open to all emerging market and developing countries, all, without exception. And it's open also to Western countries that may want to come in as lenders, high-income countries that may come in as lenders. They have not done that, with the exception of the United Arab Emirates, different case, high-income country. But all the others are middle-income countries or low-income countries. All the 10, and I believe that maybe Poland would be a good candidate, although I never heard about it being approached by the bank.
Well, that's very interesting, by the way, when it comes to some similarities between Latin American countries in Poland, when it comes to the policy of International Monetary Fund and World Bank as well. I mean the conditions of the loans. We know that the term Washington Consensus was drafted for Latin American countries in the 80s, back in the 80s, I think. But we got the same conditions from International Monetary Fund and World Bank in the beginning of our transformation after the fall of the Eastern Bloc. So do you think that International Monetary Fund and other Western-led financial institutions still impose and that they are deemed to impose all those conditions which in the past were called Washington Consensus?
I think this still holds. Your summary is correct, in my opinion. What we have are Washington-based institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, that are controlled by the United States and by the major Western European countries, plus Japan. These 3 blocks of power, and Canada, these 3 blocks of power working together with Australia also. They dominate the IMF and the World Bank. It's the Western system of power. No? The countries of Latin America are excluded from that. So we often, what do? We avoid as much as possible going to the fund, exactly because of what you said, because of the macroeconomic conditions that are not always tailored to the needs of the countries that are in difficulties. So Brazil, for instance, has been avoiding the fund for a long, long time now. The last program we had ended in 2013, if I'm not mistaken. Even before that, really. Anyway, Brazil has been away from the fund a long time. So the weaker countries of Latin America are the ones that are seeking support from the fund. Now, Poland is a special case because Poland received support from a credit line called the flexible credit line, which I helped to create, which has very low conditions. Poland was one of the few countries that had access to that line. And this is, of course, an advantage for Poland. But anyway, on the whole, I think Poland is one of the countries that may not feel sufficiently represented in the fund. In the executive board of the fund, it is part of a chair, if I remember correctly, shared with Switzerland. So Poland and Switzerland share the executive director position, but it's only one chair among 25. No? And I believe that Poland probably is also unhappy. Maybe not to the same extent as Latin America, but also unhappy with the IMF and the World Bank for that matter.
Yes, particularly back in the 90s when we got conditions like deregulation, privatization of large parts of our economy. So all the, let's say, neoliberal agenda was somehow externally imposed on countries like Poland at that time, of course, yes. But on the other hand, I would like to ask about the New Development Bank. Are there any conditions for a country which would be interested in cooperation with the bank as such?
Well, normally the bank lends to member countries. In some few cases, it has lent outside the membership, but mostly it's to member countries, almost always. And we designed the bank exactly to be free of conditionality. That was the goal. Of course, the bank has to approve projects. Huh? Projects need to be sound. But when we discuss projects with member countries, we make the point of respecting the framework, the policy framework and policy priorities of the borrowing country. Very different from the World Bank and the IMF. The World Bank seeks to reinvent the countries it lends to with policies conceived in Washington. The same goes for the IMF. No? So the NDB may not have made a big difference until now, but the original goal stands. It's part of the strategy. It's part of the Articles of Agreement of the bank. And I believe, I'm a bit hesitant to respond to your question because one weak point of the New Development Bank is lack of transparency. You know, so when you're no longer in the bank, as I now am, you don't know really what's going on. You know? By the way, one of the reasons for this lack of transparency is that we delegated transparency issues to the Russians. Now, the Russians are great people, but they're not, they're not into the business of transparency. On the contrary, they're in the business of fighting against information wars, hiding things. So the bank is very opaque, not only because of the Russians, but the Russians have given their contribution there. And so when we look at the projects, let's say you want to know about the projects of the bank. If you go into the website, you'll have very little information about the projects, very little. So I hope they're working, but I cannot guarantee. You know, I don't know if you know, but right now the president of the New Development Bank is a former president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, partly Bulgarian in origin. Dilma Rousseff is a very qualified person. She's been the president of a country. So she's struggling, and I hope, and I think she is making some success in making this bank move forward. I'm going to Shanghai again shortly in June probably, and I will visit the bank again and try to see how it's doing. As a founding member, I have a special interest that this bank be successful.
And what are the main obstacles according to you, for new countries which, as you told, they were planning on, they were supposed to join NDB, but well, still they haven't?
I wonder why, because since my time there, we tried enormously. I spoke to more than 50 countries around the world, country by country, to bring them into the bank. After I left, for some reason, actually, before I left, we had one problem: Russia again. Russia wanted the NDB to lend to Russia and was fearful of having enemies of Russia enter the bank. So Russia blocked all conversations, all blocked very vigorously. India is also a problem because India has fears that countries linked to China might enter and weaken its position in the bank. So it's really a shame. When we designed the Articles of Agreement, we made a point to avoid that any decision be taken by consensus. Because if you take consensus, rigidly understood as unanimity, every single member has a veto. That's in the Articles of Agreement. But in practice, the bank is seeking consensus every time. So if Russia is against, the country doesn't come in. If India is against, the country doesn't come in. We almost never overrule an objecting country, which makes a paralysis, So again, it's too bad, but we as countries are still struggling to become, really internationally relevant countries, with the exception of China, perhaps. But all the other founding members of the New Development Bank are struggling still. But again, as I said, I think we will move forward. There are other cases of international institutions that begin very poorly or regularly and then take off. One case in point is the CAF, Comunidade Andina de Fomento, here in Latin America. It started off very badly, and now it's one of the major multilateral development banks in the world, although it is very little known, even in Latin America.
When it comes to Latin America, I'd like to ask you a question about possible BRICS enlargement in the future. I mean, the group as such. We remember that Argentina was eager to join BRICS before the political change which occurred there. Are there any more Latin American countries which, in your opinion, would be ready to join the group as such?
Well, for example, Uruguay has been approved as member a long time ago. The last I heard is that Uruguay is having difficulty with its parliamentary approval of joining. Too bad, huh? But I hope we can overcome that. The other thing is Colombia. The other country is Colombia. Colombia has joined the bank. Very important addition to the bank. Argentina, you're talking about the bank or the political formation?
The political economic bloc, BRICS as such. Mm-hmm. And bank as well, by the way. Mm-hmm.
Uruguay and Colombia are members of the bank.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But Argentina was invited to become a member of the political formation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And thankfully, it rejected the invitation. Because if we had had now Argentina in the BRICS process, with the Milei directly subordinated to Trump, Argentina would be a major problem inside the group. Especially because the group also functions on the basis of unanimity. So Argentina would be a major stumbling block. The other country that was invited and did not reply, you may know this, is Saudi Arabia.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Again, thankfully, because Saudi Arabia is now in the Western camp firmly because of the war that broke out against Iran. The other country that, moving away from Latin America, but the other country that was invited and accepted to join, besides Iran, was United Arab Emirates. Now, I wonder why. Where did this idea come from to invite United Arab Emirates? It's a high-income country, okay. It's rich, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the BRICS geopolitically. It seems that I have to double check on that, but it seems that the country that promoted the entry of United Arab Emirates was India. And you know, India is a problem for the BRICS right now. Major problem. The major problem, for reasons that we can discuss if you want.
Yes, it's an interesting question. I mean, when it comes to India, not on the economical, but on the political level, its attitude towards Iran, and even, let's say, supporting, as we know, supporting some military actions of the coalition, Israeli-US coalition fighting Iran, was, quite a strange thing. And I would like to ask you if it is still possible to integrate within the BRICS bloc concerning the contradictions existing within. Yeah? On the example of India, in this case. Yes.
This has always been a problem, but it became worse now with the increasingly serious geopolitical situation and military with the attack on Iran. India has two things that disturb us, among, let's say, more than two, but let's just mention a few. Israel, the link to Israel. How is it possible that Premier Modi goes to Israel shortly before the attack on Iran, hugging Netanyahu, a war criminal, making speeches to the Knesset? And, you know, this is if I were Indian, I would be ashamed of this, you know. It's something that really is scandalous. No? It's not BRICS-like behavior, of course, because the BRICS are supposed to be a group of countries that are reformist, let's say. They're not anti-West. They try to build an alternative to the West without necessarily being in conflict with the West. Iran is a BRICS member, as I said. So Iran fits better into the group than India, despite the fact that India was a founding member, as you know. The problem is the Modi government. The Modi government is, from this perspective, much worse than the previous prime minister, Mohammed Singh. Mohammed Singh, let me tell you, was a leader that promoted, that came with the idea of creating a new development bank. It was India, you know, and the other countries agreed. Now India's completely different. I don't want to justify what India is doing, but if we try briefly to explain what's going on, India has problems with Pakistan on the one hand and with China on the other. It can no longer rely, as it did so in the past, on the good relation with Russia. Not that the relation with Russia is bad, but Russia has become very close to China, especially after the invasion of Ukraine. So Soviet Union, Russia is not fully there for India. So where does it look to? It looks to the United States. It fears China. Modi has intensified the problems with Pakistan by his attitude towards Muslim minorities. And so India's there, trying to balance, but moving very close to the United States now. Despite the fact, this is surprising to me, despite the fact that last year in 2025, Trump stabbed India in the back with those very high tariffs. Despite that, India is still playing the card of the United States. And this is terrible because, you know, in 2026, India is the country that chairs the BRICS process. So what can we expect of India's chairmanship of the BRICS? Zero. Not that, as a Brazilian, I need to tell that Brazil's chairmanship last year in 2025 was a fiasco, a major disappointment. So I cannot criticize India very much. But going forward, what can we expect? In 2027, China takes on the chairmanship. So I hope that China next year will do a better job than India and Brazil have done. Well, India still has time, but I don't expect India, given its links to Israel and given its links to, especially to the United States, I don't expect India to come forward with anything relevant.
So do you think that it's China who could be the main driving force of BRICS integration as such?
I think China and Russia are the main driving forces, because these are the two, and Iran too. Russia and China are the two large, very large countries that have resisted Western pressure in a major way. China has given us a marvelous example of how to deal with American aggression last year when they responded to Trump's tariff policies. Russia is showing on the battlefield that it has to be respected. Iran is doing the same. So this is not very true, to be quite frank with you, of other countries of the BRICS. India, I mentioned, but South Africa and Brazil are also relatively weak links. Why? Because here in Brazil, we have a large, rich minority that looks to the West, that looks to the United States especially, and also to Europe. They think that we are part of the West. Brazil is not part of the West. Brazil is part of the global South. It is geographically in the West, but geopolitically, it's not accepted as an equal by Western countries. That's why we're on BRICS. So, but Brazil doesn't have a consensus on that, you see. So last year, for example, when Brazil tried to take some steps, opposition within the country was big, you know. And the threats made by Trump scared a lot of people inside the government in Brazil. Not Lula, not President Lula, but many of his ministers and advisors were scared with the threats that Trump made. And so it's too bad, but there was paralysis on our side too.
That's another question about Latin America as such. I mean, if you read the US strategy, they openly claim that they want to revive Monroe Doctrine, or I mean, some commentators even called it Donroe Doctrine, which would be more aggressive than Monroe Doctrine, the historical one. And on the other hand, there are some analysts that claim that Brazil is the only single country who could somehow oppose this idea of US domination over Western Hemisphere. Do you think that the Brazilian potential as such, and that Brazil itself could become a kind of, let's say, pivot of independent Latin America?
Look, I read carefully both documents of strategy that were made public by the United States. The one on national strategy, end of last year, and the one on defense strategy this January. And both of them stress hegemony of the United States in the Western Hemisphere. Western Hemisphere understood from Greenland to Patagonia. They don't want to leave anything aside. And the attack on Venezuela early January was, in my view, already an implementation of this. You know, it was really scandalous. You know, maybe your viewers don't know, but in my memory, there's never been an attack on South America until now. It's the first time in a long, long history. You know? So it's quite shocking, especially, let's be frank here, especially because the United States got away with it with almost no cost, relatively low costs, and now dominates the Del C government, has become a protectorate of the United States. So this was quite serious. Now, if you look at the strategy of the United States, it's not true, as some people have interpreted, that the United States is retreating to the Western Hemisphere. No. It wants to assert its control over the Western Hemisphere, but it has not given up in any way its major goal of remaining the global hegemon. That's quite clear there, you know. And the actions took that afterwards they took against Iran show this. The United States is not restraining itself to the Western Hemisphere. Now, in the Western Hemisphere, what do you have? Canada is difficult to count on. I know Canada quite well. Canada is an important country, but not independent of the United States. If you look down to the south, what are the countries that in the moment are not aligned with Trump? Colombia is one, Brazil is another, Mexico is another, Nicaragua is another, and Cuba. I believe I got the list complete. The rest is already aligned to Donald Trump and to the Trump doctrine, Donroe doctrine, as you said. Milei is the most important case, but you have several others. That's why it's become crucial for Brazil to play an independent role going forward. That I don't want to sound, partisan here, but that I'm not a member of the political party of Lula, the president Lula. I'm often very critical of him. But given the fact that the opposition to him in the re-election now, campaign for re-election in 2026, is coming from the Trump people in Brazil, Flávio Bolsonaro, who's the son of the former President Bolsonaro, makes me really worry that Lula be re-elected. He's still the favorite, but it's a tight race. And from the point of view of Donald Trump and the United States, the best thing, the easiest way of asserting control over the Western Hemisphere is to win, to make Lula lose the election. It will be held in October this year. So this is a quite decisive, geopolitically speaking, this is a quite decisive election here in Brazil for the entire world. And before that, the one in Colombia, also very important. If Petro manages to elect a successor, Colombia will remain in our camp, which is also very important. Now, let me tell you briefly, Claudia Sheinbaum is brilliant, the Mexican president, a lady, Jewish, great president, She's doing a great job, and we need to consider that Mexico is very dependent on the United States, economically speaking. And despite that, she's being very courageous, and she is faced up to the American arbitrariness. Well, Cuba's an example of a country. Small country, 10 million inhabitants, as you know, more or less the same population as Israel, and resisting since the early 60s to sanctions and persecutions by the large superpower on its borders, quite near. So I do hope that Brazil will help more for Cuba to sustain its independence. And I've been listening to Cuban leaders. They are great people, very articulate, very serious people, and much, much better than the leadership of Europe and the United States. I mean, Western Europe and the United States right now. It's amazing to see, So I really hope that Cuba will escape from this major trap. And but let's see. One thing for us that is good, that I hope that will play some role. This is sort of egoistic, what I'm going to say now. The fact that the United States is held up in Iran and the Middle East helps us because it cannot focus on us. It focuses somewhere else. No? But the United States is very powerful. It may do simultaneously many things. In any case, Iran is showing that the United States can't get away with everything. Right?
And I'm wondering, what are the socio-economical roots of the support for, well, let's call them Trumpist candidates or Trumpist political forces in Latin America? I mean, you have so powerful tradition of sovereignist, independent Latin American thought and political history, all those liberation movements and so on. But on the other hand, let's say the pro-US Trumpist camp is growing all over Latin America, I mean, in the electoral process. What are the real roots of that? What do you think?
It's a difficult question. I think that, let me try to answer it there are studies of this which I unfortunately, am not fully familiar with. But I think that one thing is the evangelical churches that have been put into Brazil over the decades with American support, with US support, and these churches are propagating a completely different vision of the world from the tradition that you mentioned, the sovereign tradition. And amazing as this may seem, they cultivate Israel. They're Christian, but they cultivate Israel, flags of Israel, banners of Israel. The son of Jair Bolsonaro, Flávio Bolsonaro, who will be running against Lula, he went to Israel. He paid homage to Israel repeatedly. The same as his father, now arrested, did the same in the past. So it's a very dangerous situation because Israel, I submit, is the worst country in the world, and it's capable of interfering very much here in alliance with the United States, but even independently, because Israel is a very well-prepared country, one must recognize it. Intelligence services, money, the Zionist lobby in the United States and here in Brazil. We have a quite strong Zionist lobby also here in Brazil. So the answer is not complete. Second thing I would mention, just to try to give you a better picture, is that the nationalist left-wing or center-left governments, Lula, Dilma Rousseff, that I just mentioned, they have not managed to really solve the problems of the people. Brazil remains a poor country with very high inequality, poor social services, poor infrastructure, transport in major urban cities, in major urban places, So the population is not responding. It does not feel that it has been, attended to. You see, it's similar to what you have in the United States, and Europe, Western Europe. The progressive, let's put it this way, parties of Europe and here in Brazil, the Labour Party here in Brazil, they cannot govern on their own. They don't have strength to govern on their own. So they ally with the traditional right. The traditional right contains the changes in the government. See, the government is undermined from within. That happened in Germany, that happened in France, that happened in Britain. It's happening also in Brazil. So Lula is constrained by Congress, controlled by the right, and by the fact that in his administration, there are many people that work against this tradition of sovereignty. He's doing his best, but his best is perhaps not enough, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's come to my region of the world, Central and Eastern Europe. I know that you have contributed to the Brazilian proposal of a peace plan for Ukraine. You elaborated on some ideas. Could you present basic principles, according to you, of how we could achieve peace in this war, which is waged for more than 4 years now? Yes.
Yeah, I did write an article that circulated here in the Brazilian government, which I called "Give Peace a Chance in Ukraine." But since I published that article, so many things have happened that I believe that the proposal I made there is no longer possible. So I think that in current circumstances, Ukraine and the West would have to recognize the fact that the 4 oblasts plus Crimea will remain with Russia, which is not very strange, really, because these 4 provinces plus Crimea, if I'm not mistaken, are mostly Russophones, almost entirely. So they're linked to Russia, culturally speaking, linguistically. The Ukrainian government was very unfortunate in its behavior to the Russian minorities in the eastern part of the country. It persecuted language. It persecuted the use of Russian language in schools. It did a lot of harm. It refused to give autonomy to Donbass, which would have solved the problem at one stage. And now the Russians have spent a lot of money, suffered a lot of casualties, and incorporated these 4 provinces plus Crimea into Russia legally. So I don't believe that they will move back on that. So I think I'm not entirely sure about the stance that Poland is taking on this. But I understand Poland has a long tradition of problems with Russia. History is very bad. So I understand that Poland is suspicious, is distrustful. But I submit that Russia does not have the strength, does not have the will to attack other countries, the Baltic states, Poland, no one. So there's been some mythology, I believe, in Western Europe, in Europe in general, about this. If I were a European, I would be eager to see this issue solved, completely, solved completely. So, relations between Europe and Russia can be reestablished economically, politically, pacify the whole thing. Unfortunately, now this means Ukraine giving up about 20-25% of its territory before 2014. It's too bad. But if the war continues, Ukraine may lose even more territory. So I don't understand why the Ukrainians don't, stop now and reach a deal. They may have to change government for that. But I think this would be very important for them, for the world, in fact, because this war is a useless war that should never have happened, in my opinion. Could not have happened.
That's true. I totally agree with you. And by the way, I think that Brazil and other countries which look at all this war from a distance, geographic distance, and are not engaged, could be perfect mediators in solving such conflicts. We cannot be mediators here in Europe because we are engaged financially, militarily, politically engaged in the conflict as such. But Brazil could play such a role, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, my last question, if you don't mind, would be about Poland. And I will just reveal one secret that before we started the interview, we were chatting about one of the Polish economists you know and you appreciate. Could you tell our viewers and readers which one is that?
I'll do that. But before, let me tell you, Brazil can be a mediator, but not alone. It would have to join a group of countries.
That's true.
Say, for example, Turkey, countries that might be seen as relatively neutral. Let me tell you for a fact that President Lula tried to mediate and did not manage. He actually tried personally with Putin, with Zelensky, and he was not successful so far. And now about Poland, I'm a great admirer of Polish culture. For example, you mentioned the economist. Kalecki is a great macroeconomist. He preceded Keynes. He was making the same important points before Keynes wrote the general theory. And he's not so well known. He's pretty well known in Brazil, In Brazil, he's pretty well known among economists, but not in the Western mainstream economic schools. And Kalecki is really important. He has very important publications. And the other thing I very much like about Poland is Polish culture. We spoke before we started. Andrzej, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. One of the greatest.
Yes.
One of the greatest film directors in history, notably his film on Danton, with a Polish actor playing the role of Robespierre. Marvelous film, one of the best I've ever seen. And the other one is The Maestro, also one of the greatest films that I've ever seen. So, not to speak of Chopin, Chopin is hors concours. So I'm very glad to be able to speak to you today. For the first time, I'm giving an interview to a Polish media, and I'm glad that I could do it.
Thank you very much, Professor. And if you don't mind, after we publish this interview, there will be a lot of questions, I guess, from our viewers. So if you find some time once more, we would like to ask you a lot of more questions.
Okay, I'll be glad to do so. Send the questions to me, and I will try to answer them as best as I can.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and see you.